That night was supposed to be simple, quiet, forgettable, but it carried a weight Emily Harper did not understand until much later. The house in the Chicago suburbs was neat and warm, dinner on the stove, soft music playing from her phone, and a message blinking on the kitchen counter. Daniel had texted again, working late, don't wait up. It wasn't the first time. It had become routine, like brushing teeth or locking the doors. Emily read the message, typed "Okay, drive safe," and stood still for a moment longer than usual. The silence in the house felt louder than any argument. 12 years of marriage had not been cruel or dramatic, it had simply faded into something steady and dull. They had built a good life. A safe life. A son who laughed easily and loved dinosaurs. A mortgage paid on time. Vacations planned months ahead. But somewhere between school lunches and business calls, Emily had begun to feel invisible. Not unloved, not betrayed, just unseen. She cleaned the kitchen slowly, packed the untouched dinner into containers, and checked the clock. Her son was already at her sister's house for a sleepover, which meant the night stretched wide and empty in front of her. She could stay home, watch a show, fall asleep before Daniel returned. That was the responsible choice. Instead, she grabbed her coat and keys before she could change her mind. She told herself she only needed air. The drive downtown felt strange, like she was skipping work or breaking a small rule no one else knew existed. The city lights grew brighter as she crossed the bridge, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a quiet pulse of excitement. She parked near the river and walked without a clear plan, heels tapping against the pavement, wind brushing her hair back from her face. Laughter spilled from restaurants. Music drifted from open doors. People moved in groups, dressed up, alive. Emily realized she had not been out alone at night in years. After wandering for a few minutes, she stopped in front of a small jazz bar she remembered from college days. The sign glowed soft blue. The sound of a saxophone floated through the door, smooth and steady. Without giving herself time to think, she stepped inside. The room was warm and dim, small round tables filled with couples and friends leaning close to talk. She slid onto a stool at the bar and ordered a glass of red wine. The bartender nodded and moved on. Emily wrapped her fingers around the glass and took a slow sip. She told herself she was just observing, just listening, not searching for anything. The band played an old, gentle tune. She closed her eyes for a second and let the sound settle in her chest. When she opened them, she noticed him sitting 2 seats away. He looked calm, almost thoughtful, dressed in a navy blazer, his hair slightly touched with gray at the temples. He wasn't scanning the room or checking his phone. He seemed present, like he belonged exactly where he was. She glanced once, then looked away. She wasn't here for attention. Still, after a few minutes, she sensed him glance back. Not boldly, not in a way that made her uncomfortable. Just curious. The music paused between sets, and the noise level rose as people talked louder. That's when he spoke, his voice low and steady. He commented on the band, saying Fridays were their best nights. The line was simple, almost casual, but it broke the quiet bubble around her. Emily smiled politely and replied that she hadn't known there were better nights. He introduced himself as Michael Bennett, visiting from Toronto for a conference. His tone carried no pressure, no assumption. She introduced herself too, surprised at how natural it felt. The conversation unfolded easily. He asked about Chicago winters, about good coffee spots, about what she did for work. When she mentioned interior design, he leaned in slightly, genuinely interested. Most people nodded and changed the subject. He asked about her favorite project. She found herself describing a lakeside home she had redesigned, the way light hit the walls in late afternoon. As she spoke, she realized she hadn't talked about her work with that much energy in a long time. Michael listened without interrupting, without checking his phone. That simple attention felt powerful. She noticed how long it had been since someone asked her questions without rushing. She mentioned she was married almost automatically, as if it were part of her introduction. He didn't react dramatically. Just nodded once, respectful. The band began playing again, and the saxophone filled the space between them. Around them, couples leaned closer, some laughing softly, others swaying to the rhythm. Emily felt a small warmth rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. It was awareness. Awareness that she was still a woman who could sit in a bar, talk to a stranger, and feel interesting. For years, her world had been schedules and reminders. Tonight, she felt present. Michael shared that he had divorced 2 years ago. No bitterness, just honesty. He said travel felt easier now but sometimes lonelier. There was something steady about him, like he had faced storms and come out quieter but stronger. Emily caught herself wondering what it would be like to live a life that was not mapped out years in advance. The thought surprised her. She wasn't unhappy, she reminded herself. She was stable. But as the music wrapped around them and the city hummed outside, she felt the sharp edge of something she had ignored for too long. She had been surviving her marriage instead of living inside it. When Michael smiled at something she said, she felt seen in a way that startled her. She checked the time on her phone and realized nearly an hour had passed. It felt like 10 minutes. A part of her whispered that she should leave before the night turned into something complicated. Another part, softer but stronger, wanted to stay just a little longer. The saxophone rose into a slow, aching melody, and Emily stared into her glass, knowing that what she felt was not about this man beside her. It was about the empty space inside her life that she had finally allowed herself to notice. And as she sat there under dim lights, talking to a stranger who listened as if her words mattered, she had no idea that this ordinary Friday night was quietly moving her toward a choice that would change everything. Emily knew she should have left after the first drink, but the music returned, softer and deeper, and she stayed, telling herself it was harmless to sit a little longer and talk, because talking was not betrayal, it was not crossing a line, it was simply two adults sharing stories. In a crowded room, yet the longer she remained beside Michael, the more she felt something inside her waking up, something she had pushed down for years. He asked her what first made her love design, and she told him about painting her childhood bedroom light blue in a small house in Ohio, how she saved allowance money to buy new curtains, how her mother told her she had an eye for beauty, and he listened like the memory mattered, like she mattered, and when she laughed at herself for sounding dramatic, he said, "It's not dramatic to care about what you love," and the simple sentence stayed with her. She asked about Toronto, about his work in architecture consulting, about what it was like to start over after divorce, and he answered calmly, no anger in his voice, only honesty, saying sometimes you don't realize a relationship is fading until you look up and feel alone in the same room, and that line hit her chest harder than she expected because it felt too familiar. She looked down at her ring for a brief second, then wrapped her fingers around her glass, reminding herself she was a married woman, a mother, someone who had built a life carefully brick by brick, and yet sitting there she felt lighter than she had in months. The band shifted into a slow rhythm, the kind that made conversations quieter and thoughts louder, and Michael leaned slightly closer, not invading her space, just enough to hear her better, and she noticed the steady way he spoke, the patience in his tone, the way he didn't rush to fill silence but allowed it to breathe. "Are you happy?" he asked gently, not as a challenge but as a sincere question, and she paused because no one had asked her that in a long time, not directly, not without distraction, and she searched for an honest answer, realizing how easy it would be to say yes and end the topic, but something about the night made her choose truth instead. "We're stable," she replied, her voice softer than before, and even as she said it, she understood how small the word sounded. He nodded slowly and said stability can feel safe, but it can also feel quiet, and she surprised herself by replying, quiet can turn into lonely, and once the word left her mouth she felt exposed, as if she had opened a window in a locked room. Michael didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, didn't judge, he simply met her eyes with understanding, and that Understanding felt more intimate than any touch could have been. Around them glasses clinked, people laughed, someone near the stage cheered, yet the space between them felt still and focused, like the world had narrowed down to a small circle of light. Emily's mind raced through memories of Daniel, early years filled with road trips and late-night talks, the way he used to leave notes in her purse, how they once danced in their kitchen while pasta boiled over, and she felt a sharp ache realizing how long it had been since they had done anything without checking the clock. She wasn't angry at him, she knew he worked hard, she knew he carried pressure, but she also knew she had slowly disappeared behind responsibilities. Michael asked if she ever took time for herself, and she almost laughed because she couldn't remember the last time she did something simply because she wanted to. She told him about her son, about soccer practice and science projects, about how motherhood filled her heart but also consumed her schedule, and he smiled warmly, saying she spoke about her child with pride, and that made her chest swell with love and guilt at the same time. She reminded herself again that this was only conversation, that nothing inappropriate had happened, but emotions do not always follow rules, and she felt the pull of attention, the thrill of being interesting to someone new. When the band paused again, Michael stood and offered his hand for a dance, saying softly, "One song?" Nothing more, and her heart jumped because the offer felt symbolic, like stepping onto a thin line drawn in sand. She hesitated, aware that dancing could be innocent yet deeply personal, aware that saying yes would mean admitting she wanted to feel close to someone, even for a few minutes. She thought about how long it had been since Daniel had asked her to dance anywhere, how even at weddings they sat through slow songs without moving, and the memory stung more than she expected. Before she could overthink it, she placed her hand in his, telling herself it was just music, just movement, nothing that would change her life. They walked to the small open space near the stage, other couples already swaying gently, and when he placed his hand respectfully at her back, she felt a quiet spark run through her, not wild or reckless, just alive. They moved slowly, careful not to stand too close, yet she could sense his steady breathing, the warmth of his presence, and she became aware of her own heartbeat, fast and uneven. The world blurred at the edges as the saxophone carried a soft, emotional melody, and for a moment she forgot the kitchen dishes, the unanswered emails, the long evenings waiting alone. She felt like the younger version of herself, the woman who once believed love should feel bright and intentional. She told herself again that she was not doing anything wrong, that dancing was harmless, but deep inside she knew the danger was not in the steps, it was in the feeling growing quietly between them. When the song ended, she stepped back first, creating space before the moment could stretch further, and she saw something in his eyes, a mix of admiration and caution, and it mirrored her own conflict. They returned to the bar without speaking for a second, both understanding that something had shifted, that the night was no longer casual. Emily checked the time and realized hours had passed, and a wave of reality washed over her, reminding her of who she was and what she stood to lose. She felt torn between two truths: she was a loyal wife who valued her family, and she was a woman who longed to feel chosen, heard, desired in a quiet, respectful way. Michael didn't push for more, didn't suggest leaving together, didn't test her boundaries, which somehow made the moment more powerful because the choice rested fully with her. She sensed that if she stayed much longer, emotions would grow harder to control, and even if nothing physical happened, her heart would cross a line that could not be uncrossed. The music played on, soft and tempting, but inside her mind alarms began to ring gently, warning her that attraction can begin in the smallest ways, in shared stories, in eye contact held too long, in questions that feel too personal. She took a slow breath, aware that the night was moving toward a turning point, and as she looked at Michael across the dim light of the bar, she understood that what frightened her most was not the stranger beside her, but the realization that she was capable of wanting more than the quiet life she had accepted, and that awareness alone felt like standing on the edge of something she could not fully see yet could already feel pulling her forward. The air outside the jazz bar felt cooler than Emily expected, and the sudden silence after the music made her thoughts louder than ever. She walked beside Michael toward the parking lot, heels tapping against the sidewalk, city lights reflecting off the river like broken pieces of glass, and every step felt like it carried weight. Because she knew the night had reached its edge, neither of them spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much hung between them, and she could feel the quiet question in the space they shared. What now? She told herself to keep walking, to say goodbye quickly, to turn this into a memory before it became a mistake, yet her heart was beating fast, not with fear but with the sharp awareness that she had not felt this alive in years. Michael finally broke the silence. His voice calm, saying he was glad he met her, and the simple honesty in his tone made her chest tighten. She replied that she hadn't planned to come out tonight, that she almost stayed home, and he gave a small smile and said sometimes the nights we don't plan are the ones that show us what we've been missing. That sentence lingered in her mind as they reached her car. She paused with her hand on the door handle, knowing this was the moment where choices begin to matter. The parking lot was quiet, only a few streetlights glowing above them, and for the first time since they met, she felt vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with emotion. Michael stood a respectful distance away, hands in his pockets, not touching her, not moving closer, and somehow that made the tension stronger because he wasn't pushing, he was leaving the decision to her. She thought about how easy it would be to continue the night, to suggest coffee somewhere else, to sit and talk until morning, to pretend that one night could exist outside the rules of real life. She imagined telling herself it was harmless, that she deserved a small escape, that no one would know. But then another image appeared in her mind, Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, tired, unaware of how close she stood to crossing a line, and her son's bright smile when he ran into her arms after school. The weight of those images pressed against her heart. Michael spoke softly, saying, "You deserve to feel alive," and she felt tears sting her eyes because he wasn't wrong. She had felt alive tonight, seen and heard in ways that had faded at home, and that truth scared her more than the attraction itself. She turned toward him fully now, searching his face for something that would make the choice easier, maybe arrogance or carelessness, something that would allow her to step back without regret, but she saw only patience and quiet understanding. He told her he didn't want to complicate her life, that he respected the ring on her hand, and those words, instead of cooling the moment, made it more intense because he was acknowledging the boundary without mocking it. She realized then that the real battle wasn't between her and him, it was between who she had been and who she was becoming. For years she had chosen routine over risk, silence over confrontation, comfort over honesty, and tonight forced her to face the truth that her loneliness had grown because she had never spoken it out loud. She felt the pull to step closer, to allow herself just one brief moment of closeness that would prove she was still desirable, still capable of stirring emotion in someone new. Her heart argued that life was short, that one mistake wouldn't erase 12 years of loyalty, that she had given so much of herself already. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, reminded her that betrayal doesn't begin with actions, it begins with permission. She closed her eyes for a second and imagined waking up the next morning carrying a secret that would sit heavy in her chest, a secret that would change the way she looked at Daniel, the way she looked at herself. She understood that even if no one else ever found out, she would know, and that knowledge would build a wall between her and the life she wanted to protect. When she opened her eyes, tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. She laughed softly at herself, embarrassed by her emotion, but Michael didn't look surprised. He said gently, "This is harder than it looks," and she nodded. Because he was right. It wasn't just about attraction, it was about identity. She had always believed she was someone who kept promises, someone who faced problems instead of escaping them, and now she stood inches away from proving herself wrong. She whispered that she wanted to feel something again, and he replied that she already did. "That's why this hurt." Those words settled into her like truth. She stepped back slowly, creating physical space to match the emotional boundary she was rebuilding inside. She told him she couldn't go any further, not because she didn't want to, but because she valued the life she had built too much to risk it for a moment of comfort. He didn't argue, didn't try to change her mind, only nodded with quiet respect. In his eyes she saw disappointment, but also admiration, and that gave her unexpected strength. She realized that choosing her marriage in that moment did not mean ignoring her loneliness, it meant facing it directly. She thanked him for the conversation, for reminding her that she still had a heartbeat under all the routine, and he smiled gently, saying sometimes strangers appear only to help us see ourselves clearly. The city felt different now, not magical or tempting, but honest. She opened her car door and paused one last time, looking at him under the streetlight, knowing they would likely never meet again. There was a softness in the goodbye, a shared understanding that something meaningful had happened without crossing into something destructive. She got into the driver's seat, hands trembling slightly as she started the engine, and as she pulled away she saw him still standing there, not chasing, not waving dramatically, just watching with calm acceptance. The drive home felt longer than before, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every feeling that had surfaced. She didn't feel proud or ashamed, only aware that her marriage needed attention, aware that her heart had been starving quietly, aware that ignoring the problem would only bring her back to another dangerous edge. Someday, by the time she turned onto her street, the sky had grown darker and the houses were still. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a minute, breathing deeply, letting the weight of the decision settle inside her. She had stood at the edge of betrayal and stepped back, not because temptation was weak, but because her values were stronger. She wiped her tears, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the front door, knowing that the real challenge was not resisting a stranger, but returning home ready to speak the truth she had avoided for too long. Emily barely slept that night, not because of guilt alone but because her heart felt awake in a way it hadn't in years. She lay beside Daniel, listening to the quiet hum of the heater and the faint sound of his breathing, and instead of turning away like she often did, she studied his face in the dim light, noticing the tired lines near his eyes, the way his hand rested loosely near her pillow, and she felt a wave of emotion that surprised her because she realized she didn't want to lose him, she didn't want to replace him, she wanted to find him again. When morning light slipped through the curtains, she got up early and went into the kitchen, and for once Daniel was already there pouring coffee, scrolling through his phone as usual, but something in her had shifted. She could no longer sit across from him pretending everything was fine. Her heart pounded the same way it had in the parking lot the night before, only this time the risk was different. This time the risk was honesty. She said his name softly, and he looked up, surprised by the tone in her voice. She asked if they could talk, really talk, and he put his phone down slowly, sensing something serious. They sat at the kitchen table where so many silent meals had passed between them, and for a few seconds she almost lost her courage, almost chose comfort over truth again, but she remembered how close she had come to crossing a line and she knew silence was no longer safe. She told him she felt lonely, not abandoned, not unloved, but unseen, like they had become partners in routine instead of partners in life. Daniel frowned, confusion mixing with concern, and he admitted he thought everything was stable, that no news meant no problems. She shook her head gently and said stability without connection feels empty, and her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. She explained how she missed their late-night talks, how she missed laughing without checking the clock, how she missed feeling like a priority instead of an afterthought. Daniel leaned back, absorbing her words, and she could see the realization settling in, not defensive, not angry, just aware. He confessed that work had taken over his mind, that he believed providing for the family was the best way to show love, and he hadn't noticed the distance growing because it happened slowly, like a quiet fog. Emily listened too, understanding his pressure but refusing to ignore her own needs. She didn't mention Michael by name, didn't describe the dance or the almost choice, because the stranger was not the real issue, the emptiness was. She told Daniel she didn't want to wake up one day and feel like roommates who once loved each other, and that sentence struck him deeply. He reached for her hand across the table, something he hadn't done in months, and his grip was unsure but sincere. He said he didn't want to lose her, that he hadn't realized how much he missed them either. That small word, them, filled the space with hope. The conversation didn't fix everything instantly, but it opened a door that had been closed for too long. They talked about simple changes first, date nights without phones, shared coffee in the mornings, asking real questions instead of quick updates. Daniel suggested they see a counselor, not because they were broken but because they needed guidance rebuilding what had faded, and Emily felt relief hearing him take responsibility instead of brushing her feelings aside. Over the next few weeks, effort replaced assumption. Daniel left work earlier twice a week, even when it meant turning down extra meetings. Emily stopped hiding her frustrations behind polite smiles. They argued sometimes, not loudly, but honestly, and each honest conversation felt like clearing dust from a window. One Friday evening, Daniel surprised her with tickets to a small jazz club downtown, and when he handed them to her with a shy smile, saying he heard the sax player was better on Fridays, her breath caught because the memory of that night flashed through her mind. But this time there was no guilt, only gratitude. She dressed carefully, not for attention from strangers but because she wanted to feel beautiful beside her husband again. At the club, they sat close, knees touching under the table, and when the music slowed Daniel stood awkwardly and held out his hand. She laughed softly because he hadn't done that in years, but she placed her hand in his without hesitation. Their dance wasn't smooth, they stepped on each other's feet once and both laughed, but it felt real, grounded in shared history instead of fragile excitement. As they swayed, Daniel whispered that he was sorry for drifting, and she whispered that she was sorry for staying silent so long. The music wrapped around them, not as temptation this time but as renewal. Emily realized the decision she made in the parking lot had not only protected her marriage, it had forced her to confront what she truly wanted. She didn't want escape, she wanted connection, she didn't want secrets, she wanted effort. Later that night, walking back to their car together, Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, a simple gesture that felt stronger than anything she had almost risked weeks before. She understood then that loyalty is not just about resisting temptation, it is about choosing to fight for love even when it feels easier to walk away. Somewhere in another city, Michael likely returned to his own life, perhaps remembering her as a quiet woman who chose her marriage over a fleeting spark, and she hoped he found happiness too. But for Emily, the true turning point was not the dance with a stranger, it was the morning she spoke her truth and refused to let silence win. The decision that changed everything was not dramatic or loud, it was steady and brave, made in a quiet kitchen with sunlight on the table, and as she lay in bed that night beside Daniel, feeling his hand reach for hers in the dark, she knew that one night, two strangers, and a moment at the edge had led her back home, not to the same marriage she once accepted, but to a stronger one she was finally willing to protect and rebuild with open eyes and an honest heart.